Hello and welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you are new. My name is Gene Curl, and today I'm going to be talking about my Mormon shelf. And if you're unfamiliar with that concept, the Mormon shelf concept comes from a talk from Camilla Kimball, and she had said that when you have doubts, instead of entertaining those doubts, you take the doubt and put it on a shelf as if you were, you put it on the shelf of your mind and forget about it, kind of like if you could put something else on a literal shelf and forget about it. And she said, so we take these things and we put them on our shelf instead of entertaining our doubts. But the problem with that is, eventually you put too many things on the shelf and the shelf breaks and everything falls on the floor. And then eventually you have to deal with it. Well, I'm going to be talking about some of the items that were on my shelf. The first thing I believe that was on my shelf is when I was on my mission, I was reading the Joseph Smith history, and I noticed a huge contradiction. In verse 10 it says, "In the midst of war of words and tumult of opinion, I often said to myself, what is to be done? Who of all these parties are right, or are they all wrong together? And if any of them be right, which is it, how shall I know it?" And then later in the narrative, after he prays and Jesus Christ and God the Father comes down, it says in verse 18, "My object in going to inquire of the Lord was to know which of all the sects was right, that I might know which to join. No sooner, therefore, did I get possession of myself as to be able to speak, than I asked the personages who stood above me in the light, which of all the sects was right. For at this time it had never entered into my heart that all were wrong." And I was like, whoa, wait a minute, that's a big contradiction right there. He had said he had often wondered which of all the churches were right, or if they were all wrong together. And then later in the narrative, he said it had never entered into his mind or into his heart that they were all wrong. But I try not to worry about that too much. I put that on my shelf. And then later, I was doing personal study on my mission, and I came across this verse in the book of Jacob, where he says, "Behold," he goes on talking about how plural marriage was bad, and then he says, "Behold, David and Solomon truly had many wives and concubines, which thing was an abominable before me, saith the Lord." And so that was in verse 24. He says that it was that David and Solomon having many wives was an abomination. Yet in section 132 of Doctrine and Covenants in verse 1, it says, "Verily thus saith the Lord unto you, my servant Joseph Smith, that inasmuch as ye have inquired unto my hand to know and understand wherein I the Lord justified my servants Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and also Moses, David, and Solomon, my servants, as to touching the principle and doctrine of their having many wives and concubines." So, Doctrine and Covenants 132 says that it was okay that David and Solomon had a lot of wives, and in the book of Jacob it says that it was an abomination. So that was a big thing. But again, I put that on my shelf and didn't think too much about it. Then later on my mission, there was this lady who fell and hurt herself, and I was asked to give her a blessing before she went to the hospital. And I felt strongly that I should give her a blessing that she would recover. And so I did. I blessed her that she would recover. And then I found out that she died the very next day. And so that was really hard for me. That kind of shook my testimony a little bit, and it shook my faith in the power of priesthood blessings. My mission president was able to tell me, well, then Doctrine and Covenants, it says that if you give somebody a blessing and they're not appointed unto death, that they will get better. And so I took that as an explanation for now and kind of put that on my shelf. Then later, I found out that Joseph Smith was involved in treasure digging before he translated the Book of Mormon. And that bothered me, because I thought, he was searching for treasure, and then he found the golden plates. That bothered me, but I put that on my shelf. most of these things weren't really that big of an issue. But then I was on my mission. I thought I needed to convert the whole world. And I have a lot of family who are not members of the church. So I wrote a letter to one of my uncles trying to convince him that the church was true. He wasn't having any of it, so he wrote me a long letter back, and he told me about the book of Abraham. Now, I'd read the book of Abraham. I believed it was the scriptures. And I knew that Joseph Smith translated it from papyrus that he found, or that he bought. But my uncle told me about the story about how later they found those same papyri, and then they were translated by Egyptologists, and it turned out that they had absolutely nothing to do with the book of Abraham or with Abraham at all, and none of what Joseph Smith said was in the papyri was actually in the papyri, and that therefore the book of Abraham could not be a translation of those papyri. And that really bothered me, and I called my mission president about it. But he told me, hey, you know the Book of Mormon is true, and if you don't, keep praying until you do know the Book of Mormon is true. And he told me, look, you don't have time to worry about stuff like this on your mission. And so I said, yep, you're right, I don't have time to worry about this stuff. I put it on the shelf. Other thing that came to bother me is all of the racism in the Book of Mormon, where it talks about how they were cursed with a dark skin because of their sins. And having dark skin because of sin, that really bothered me, especially since I served in Hawaii. And almost all the people that I interacted with had dark skin, and they were some of the best people that I had ever met. And I thought, I don't believe that they have dark skin because their ancestors sinned. I also discovered some of Brigham Young's racism. Brigham Young said that if the chosen people mixes their seed with the seed of Cain, meaning the black people, that the law of the Lord is death on the spot, and it shall always be the case. That bothered me quite a bit. People tried to tell me, well, Brigham Young didn't actually say that, or he was speaking as a man. But either way, that bothered me, because even if he was speaking as a man, because in the official declaration, it says that the prophet of the Lord can never lead the church astray. And as soon as he does something that'll lead the church astray, God will take him out of his place. Well, I am sure that what Brigham Young said about the blacks, that led a lot of people astray and led them to racism. And Brigham Young wasn't taken out of his spot. So either the church is okay with racism, or Brigham Young wasn't really a prophet, and the church wasn't true. Either one of those I couldn't accept. But again, I took that and put it on my shelf and tried not to worry about it. Another thing that was a big thing for me was the Tower of Babel. How everybody spoke the same language, and they were building this tower, and then God decided that if they were able to work together, that nothing would be impossible for them. And so he confounded their language so that they couldn't work together anymore. And changed their skin color and changed everything about them, changed their languages. And I thought, I just can't believe that that's how we have the different races. Another big thing for me was the Noah and the ark. I just couldn't believe that the whole world was covered with water, and that, when you do the math and figure out how much water that it would have taken to cover the highest mountain, or even if you don't go to the highest mountain, even if you just go to Mount Ararat, which is traditionally believed where the ark landed, that is so much water that there's no way that water could have all covered the earth and just disappeared. Not to mention that the geological record doesn't support a massive flood. You go to the Grand Canyon and everything is in layers where it should be if it happened over millions of years. And so I just couldn't believe that the earth was 6,000 years old and that 4,000 years ago there was a major flood. Also, even if you go by Ken Ham's definition of just kinds, instead of and having kinds on the boat instead of having all these different species, there still wasn't enough room on the boat for all of these animals and their feed. And so the Noah and the Ark story was extremely problematic to me. But I tried not to let that bother me, and I put that on the shelf. Then in college, I had a college professor that pointed out that there was no evidence that the Exodus story ever happened. And I thought, well, that's not true. There's lots of evidence that the Exodus happened. And so I started doing research outside of class, and I found out that the professor was correct, that there is no evidence to support the Exodus. And that really shook my testimony. But I tried to put that on the shelf. At the same time, I was learning about evolution, and I tried not to believe in evolution because I knew that I could not believe in evolution and the church. It's like Joseph Fielding Smith said, that if evolution is true, then the church is false. And so I did not want to believe in evolution, but I had to learn about it as part of my college class. So I started listening to a lot of debates between evolutionists and creationists and doing a whole bunch of research outside of class to try to prove to myself that evolution was false. The more research I did, the more I realized that evolution made sense and that there was so much evidence for it that I could not deny it. And that was a really big thing for me. I decided I wanted to have more faith in the church and more faith in Joseph Smith, and so I decided to read the book No Man Knows My History by Fawn M. Brody. And when I first started reading it, with the things it said about Joseph Smith, I thought it was a hit piece against the church. It talked about Joseph Smith translating the Book of Mormon with a rock and a hat. And I thought, that's not true. There's no way that could be true. Well, it turns out that the church actually admits that that's how the Book of Mormon was translated. With Joseph Smith having a rock in his hat, he'd have this rock in his hat, and then he'd put his face in the hat, and he would read what appeared on the rock. And I thought, well, that's crazy. That's not how I was taught that the Book of Mormon was translated. I was taught that you looked at the Book of Mormon and had it open in front of him, and he was using the Urim and Thummim to translate it. The No Man Knows My History also talked about all of Joseph Smith's wives, and I was taught that Joseph Smith only had one wife. But I had already accepted, kind of because of Brigham Young and Wilford Woodruff and the others, I had accepted the principle of polygamy, I could accept it that it was God's will. But what really bothered me about Joseph Smith's polygamy wasn't just his polygamy, it was his polyandry. He married women who had living husbands. He married mothers and daughters, which is prohibited in the Bible. He married sisters, which is prohibited in the Bible. And he had several underage wives. He had wives 16 and younger, and that really bothered me. I thought that maybe that was just another thing that Brody was lying about. I did research on it, found out that that was actually the case, and now the church actually admits that. They have a church essay on it, on the church essay series. And so, and all these things that I was questioning, I had asked my stake president about them, and my stake president said, Brother Curl, those are good questions, but I don't have an answer, and if you keep asking questions like this, I'm going to be forced to excommunicate you. The specific question that I asked him that he said that about is, I said, we believe that as God is, man may become, and as man is, God once was. And he said, yes, that's true doctrine. I said, okay, so then that means that our God has a God. And he said, yes, I guess so. I said, okay, then why are we worshiping a lower God and not worshiping the ultimate God if our God has a God? And that's when he said that. And that really, really bothered me. And I got to thinking about that, and I thought, you know, all these things, though, that the church, I said I couldn't ask about now, are now church essays on the church's essay series on the gospel doctrines topics. And I will put a link to the church's essays in the description down below. So if you want to check out the church's essay series on gospel doctrine topics, you can check it out and see that it's not an anti-Mormon source, that it's actually from the church. But a big thing that bothered me too is from the time that I joined the church, I had never had this deep, rich spiritual experience that told me the church was true like everybody said that I should. And I thought, well, I believe the church is true, so I guess that's enough. But it always bothered me that I never had this spiritual witness that the church was true, like everybody else said they did. And I thought maybe it was a defect on my part somehow. But then one day I was sitting in church, and it occurred to me that maybe nobody has had this deep spiritual experience, and that maybe it's like the emperor's new clothes. That nobody has had a spiritual experience, but they don't want to be the only one who didn't have a spiritual experience. So they all said that they had a spiritual experience, so they wouldn't be the only ones to not. And they even convinced themselves that they had a deep spiritual experience when they didn't. Just like the emperor's new clothes, nobody was willing to admit that the emperor was naked because they couldn't be the only one that didn't see the clothes. Another thing that really bothered me is, so I went to the temple on my mission, or before my mission, and the temple experience kind of bothered me. It seemed a little cultish to me, but I felt bad for thinking that, and I prayed for forgiveness and for understanding. And I went to temple as often as I could. Well, on my mission, I didn't really get a chance to go to the temple. After my mission, I went to the temple, and I realized that the temple had changed. And I remembered a quote from Joseph Smith where he said that the temple ordinance was revealed by God and that it should never change. And so the fact that the temple changed really bothered me. And so with all of these things together, it was like the perfect storm. All of these things on my shelf, it got to be so heavy that I couldn't take it anymore. And one day I was sitting in a psychology class, and the psychology professor was talking about how when we have a belief, especially if that belief is part of our identity, we fight to protect that belief even if we know it's wrong, because it's easier to fight for a belief that we know is wrong than it is to accept a new belief. And it hit me like a ton of bricks, and I'm like, holy cow, I don't believe in God. But I backpedaled from that. And I did my absolute best to believe, and I actually stayed in the church for quite a few years after that. But eventually everything got to the point where my shelf broke, and I just couldn't take it anymore. And I had to be honest with myself that I didn't believe, and I left the church. I stopped going to church, and then a few years later I had my records removed. But these aren't all of my shelf items. These were just the major ones. So if you have things on your shelf, or if you had things on your shelf, if your shelf is broken, let me know in the comments down below what things are on your shelf and what it was that was finally the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. What thing was it that actually pushed you over the edge? I will have more videos on this, probably on this topic in the future. So if you have any questions or comments, let me know. If there's anything I didn't explain fully enough and you would like me to explain more, let me know in the comments down below. Other than that, if you got any use out of this video, I would appreciate it if you would click like, share it with your friends if you think it will help. And I will catch you in the next video.